Heather Mack was a spoiled 19-year-old enjoying a life of privilege.
She was Daddy's little girl, and she was indulged.
Tommy Schaefer was a 21-year-old aspiring musician from the streets of Chicago.
He wanted to be a hip-hop artist.
When this unlikely pair fell in love in the spring of 2014, they thought they'd found their perfect match.
It's a period of huge discovery and passion.
But a tragedy in paradise would turn the couple's passion into a nightmare.
When they open it up, they find that there's a body inside.
We're all just like, how can this happen?
In order to solve the crime, investigators on 2 continents would have to unravel nearly 10 years' worth of secrets to expose a cold-blooded tale of lust, greed, and vengeance.
They called each other Bonnie and Clyde.
August 12th, 2012. It was a little past noon at a luxurious island resort when hotel staff called local police for assistance. It seemed that 2 of the hotel's guests, a mother and daughter, had mysteriously disappeared, and all efforts by staff members to locate the 2 women had, so far, resulted in dead ends.
Hotel staff had last seen the mother and daughter sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning.
They really depend on tourism, so they take this very seriously.
Wondering if missing mother and daughter might have left some clue to their whereabouts, officers asked the hotel's manager to let them search the women's room. But once inside, they made a terrifying discovery.
You had bloodstains everywhere.
The guest suite showed disturbing signs of a struggle, with the floor covered in broken glass and streaks of blood. It looked like one or both of the women had been the victim of a brutal attack.
There were immediately a lot of questions as to how this could have happened, what occurred.
The answers would send a tidal wave of fear across the island paradise and lay bare a crime so sick, twisted, and unthinkable, it would make headlines across the world. Oak Park is an affluent community on the west side of Chicago, and for 19-year-old Heather Mack, it was the place she called home. Born in 1996, Heather was the only child of famed jazz composer James Mack and socialite Sheila Von Weiss Mack.
He composed music with Quincy Jones. He received a few Grammys.
Her mother was a leader in the community and very well connected.
The Macks were a tight-knit family, but Heather developed an especially close relationship with her father.
He would take her to the movies, to bookstores, to candy stores. They would climb trees and go to the park together.
She was definitely Daddy's little girl, and she was indulged.
One thing Heather's father loved to share with her more than anything was his love of travel, and Heather's parents took her on frequent and extravagant vacations.
Heather and both of her parents traveled all over the world to beautiful resorts.
My kids would say to Heather, "Do you know how lucky you are to get to go on these kind of trips?"
But in 2006, Heather's fairy tale childhood came to a tragic end. On a family getaway in Greece, James Mack suddenly fell ill in their hotel room.
On one of their trips to Athens, he suffered a pulmonary embolism.
He passed away in the room right in front of his wife and daughter.
10-year-old Heather was devastated.
It was pretty traumatic for her to lose him so suddenly in a tragic way.
Jim was her hero. For her to lose Jim, that was real tough to overcome.
But even in death, Heather's father made sure that she and her mother would be well taken care of.
A trust fund was set up for Heather. Heather would have access to literally millions of dollars once she reached adulthood.
But financial security wasn't enough to ease Heather's broken heart. Her mother did her best to keep her spirits up, and for a while, the tragedy seemed to bring them closer together.
It's a traumatic event for both of them, and they hung together.
But Heather never fully recovered from the loss, and as she grew into a teenager, she slowly spiraled into depression. To numb the pain, Heather began experimenting with alcohol and drugs, And by the time she was nearing her high school graduation, she started skipping school in favor of all-night parties.
She was a teenager who was rebelling against authority.
There's a reason why there's the term troubled teen.
As the result, Heather's relationship with her mother began to suffer.
The relationship between her and her mother became really tumultuous and bumpy.
She would get in another fight with Sheila and she would just run off and disappear.
While Sheila was home worrying, Heather was out partying. And it was at one of those parties that Heather met a handsome young man who would change the course of her life forever. 21-year-old Tommy Schaefer.
He's athletic, he's strong, smart. She was attracted to him physically.
But Tommy was more than just a pretty face. He was also an aspiring musician like her father.
A young, aspiring, attractive black man who is into music and going places.
Heather was intrigued. Like Heather, Tommy Schaefer was also born and raised in Chicago. But Tommy hadn't grown up in an Oak Park mansion.
Tommy came from a little bit of a more gritty background. His mother was a single mother.
His father was ever really in the picture.
Money was always tight, but Tommy's mother did everything she could to make sure he was taken care of. She sent Tommy to school in affluent Oak Park, hoping it would give him a chance to escape the poverty he grew up in. He did well in school and was a gifted athlete.
Tommy was a pretty good basketball player.
But Tommy's true passion was music. He loved hip-hop, and as a teenager, he set his sights on becoming a professional rapper.
He wanted to be a hip-hop artist. He wanted fame. He wanted fortune.
After high school, Tommy left home and threw himself into his music. But while writing songs and recording his own demos satisfied his passion, it didn't provide Tommy with any money to live.
There were times when he was homeless, staying at friends' homes.
Tommy refused to give up or return home. He was determined to find a way to support himself doing what he loved. And it was through his music that Tommy eventually met the person who would change the course of his life. Performing at a party one night, he met 19-year-old Heather Mack.
Tommy saw in Heather an attractive young girl.
There's all this sexual energy between the two of them.
So intense, in fact, that Heather and Tommy hooked up that very night, and they both felt an immediate connection. But Heather's interest in Tommy was more than skin deep. She was attracted to his musical and creative side, which spoke to the void left by her father.
He's a musician, her father's a musician. They're both into the arts.
Discovering this young man felt like discovering her father again, and that pull is intense.
As for Tommy, it was about more than just sex as well. As a musician, being with the daughter of a famous jazz composer definitely had its advantages.
Tommy really got wrapped up in his relationship with Heather and all of the glamour and wealth that could come along with it.
The two quickly became inseparable, and for the first time since her father's death, Heather seemed truly happy.
Heather is probably really in love for the first time. It felt like forever love. It was the best thing that ever happened.
But not everyone was as happy about the direction in which Heather's life seemed to be headed. Heather's mother became increasingly concerned about all the drinking and late-night partying. She also didn't think that dating Tommy Schaefer was good for her wayward daughter.
She told me, Heather's hanging out with terrible kids, and I don't like this Tommy.
Sheila tried to step in and get Heather help, but that only put more of a strain on their already tense relationship.
Sheila tried. She had her seeing a therapist. She loved her daughter more than life itself.
Sheila knew she had to turn things around with Heather before it was too late. She decided to mend their relationship by doing what they'd always done as a family: travel. So she booked a 2-week luxury vacation to the island of Bali. And to her delight, Heather seemed just as excited for the trip as she was.
The mother saw this as a new beginning, and she hoped that this extravagant trip she had planned would be a way for her to reconnect with her daughter.
On August 4th, Sheila and Heather left for Bali together. It was the chance mother and daughter needed to finally heal old wounds and reconnect. But instead of rest and relaxation, the two women would find something far more terrifying lying in wait for them. Coming up, Sheila and Heather's bonding time in Bali is spoiled by an unexpected visitor.
Sheila was shocked.
And a terrifying discovery at their hotel leads police investigators to fear the worst.
All of a sudden, she disappears, nowhere to be found.
She may get kidnapped, she may be in sex slavery.
Heather Mack was a privileged and rebellious 19-year-old girl who fell in love with a 21-year-old aspiring hip-hop artist named Tommy Schaefer. But Heather's mother, Sheila, wasn't happy about the direction Heather's life was headed in, or the way their bond had deteriorated since the tragic death of Heather's father.
The relationship between the two became really bumpy.
Sheila hoped that a luxury vacation in Indonesia would help repair their strained connection. But while the island of Bali seemed like a perfect destination for a peaceful getaway, it would instead become the site of a series of disturbing and gruesome events. It all began August 12th, on what would have been the 7th day of Sheila and Heather's vacation. A cab driver had just dropped off a passenger at the hotel and was about to leave when he was flagged down by two other guests, a man and a woman. The couple quickly loaded their suitcase into the back of the cab's trunk, then hurried back inside the hotel.
They told the taxi driver, "We're checking out, we'll be right back."
The driver waited patiently for the couple in the hotel's valet line. But after half an hour, his new passengers still hadn't returned, so the driver decided to unload the couple's luggage. But when he opened the trunk, he made a disturbing discovery. The couple's suitcase had been wrapped in a white bedsheet, and a bloody stain had begun to soak through from inside the luggage.
We opened the trunk and saw the blood and called police.
Bali investigators rushed to the scene, and when they opened the suitcase, what they found was terrifying.
When they open it up, they find that there's a body inside.
The body of a middle-aged white female had been stuffed inside the suitcase.
She suffered a brutal death. She was brutally beaten about the face.
But who was the victim? Was it possible she was a guest at the hotel? And what had happened to the couple who'd put the suitcase in the taxi? Hoping to find answers, detectives began questioning employees at the resort.
They keep copies of the passports, so they can then turn that over to the investigators.
Security personnel searched the names of all the middle-aged white female guests at the hotel. There was only one who couldn't be accounted for. 62-year-old Sheila Von Weiss Mack of Chicago.
It was also revealed that Sheila was not on vacation alone, that she was also there with her daughter, Heather Mack.
The hotel manager called Sheila in Heather's room, but no one answered. So police decided to check out their hotel suite, and what they found inside was disturbing.
It did look like a crime scene. You had bloodstains everywhere.
In the middle of the floor were shards of blue glass, broken remnants from a decorative fruit bowl that had once sat on a table inside the room. Police also found the bowl's large metal handle.
They look at the handle, and there's blood all over it. And to them, it looks like it's been used to hit someone.
To investigators, it looked like they'd found a murder weapon. It was also looking more certain that Sheila was the victim inside the suitcase. But who killed her? And where was Heather? When the medical examiner shared his report, it confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Sheila Von Weiss Mack was the victim stuffed inside the suitcase. But the extent of her wounds revealed the attack had been even more vicious than they realized.
This was a brutal attack. She suffered a broken nose, a broken neck, severe facial injuries.
Investigators were stunned. Murders were a rare occurrence on the resort island, let alone something as savage as this.
This was an American tourist who was killed in such a horrific manner.
This is a place people go to relax. They really depend on tourism. So they take this very seriously.
But knowing that Sheila had been the victim of such a brutal attack left Bali police even more concerned for her missing daughter.
I think it became a serious concern as to what happened to Heather.
Police immediately began a search for the missing teenager. They started by questioning resort staff and quickly found someone who might have answers. A desk clerk had seen Sheila just hours before her body had been found.
Sheila had been in the lobby hours earlier at 3 a.m.
She comes running down to the front desk, worried sick about her daughter.
The clerk said Sheila was frantic. She'd just woken up to find that her daughter Heather was missing. Sheila could find no trace of her daughter in their room or on the resort property, and she quickly fell into a panic.
All of a sudden, she disappears, nowhere to be found. Of course, as a mother, you're going to be petrified.
Sheila was especially concerned because Heather had a habit of running away from home. After her father died, Heather had often disappeared for days at a time.
Sheila would call me and say Heather ran away and she hasn't been home for days, and she would be just worried sick.
But this wasn't Chicago. It was Indonesia. And after reading about human trafficking in third world countries, Sheila was afraid of what might happen to a young American girl wandering alone.
That was Sheila's worst fear. If Heather runs away in Bali, she may never come back. I mean, she may get kidnapped, she may be in sex slavery.
Investigators wondered, had Sheila been right? If so, they knew her daughter's life could be in danger as well. And time was running out. Coming up, as police search for Heather, a surprising discovery changes the course of their investigation.
There's dozens of security cameras around this hotel.
And the evidence leads detectives to a new suspect.
We see him get in the elevator and go to the third floor and enter the room.
By August of 2014, the steamy romance between Chicago socialite Heather Mack and aspiring musician Tommy Schaefer had been temporarily put on hold when Heather's mother took her on a luxury vacation to Bali.
She hoped that this was a chance to start over and reconnect with her daughter.
However, the trip had taken a tragic turn when 62-year-old Sheila was found beaten to death and stuffed into a suitcase. And in the American's hotel suite, police discovered evidence of a brutal attack. Adding to investigators' concerns was the fact that Sheila's daughter Heather was missing, and apparently she'd been missing long before her mother's body had been found. The night clerk told police that Sheila had come down to the front desk at 3 a.m. in a panic to report that her 19-year-old had apparently vanished.
Heather was always taken off in Chicago, and she was thinking, well, if I go to Bali and she takes off, I may never see her again.
But just as the hotel began organizing a search for the missing teenager, Heather suddenly showed back up.
At that time, her daughter walked in.
And to her mother's shock, Heather wasn't alone. Holding her hand was Tommy Schaefer.
Sheila was shocked that Tommy Schaefer showed up at the Bali hotel they were at.
Heather told her mother that Tommy had flown to Bali to surprise her. He told Heather that his love for her was so intense that he couldn't bear to be apart from her any longer. So he traveled to their resort and checked in a few hours earlier. Sheila was infuriated.
A confrontation had taken place between Heather Mack, her mother, Sheila Von Weiss, and her boyfriend, Tommy Schaefer, right there in the lobby.
Sheila also wasn't buying Heather's story that Tommy flew to Bali to surprise her. She accused Heather of stealing her credit card to pay for Tommy's room and plane ticket. Heather denied it. But Sheila had good reason to suspect her, because this hadn't been the first time Heather used her mother's credit card without permission. In the summer of 2014, Heather had booked a room with Tommy at a hotel and invited a group of their friends.
She stole Sheila's American Express card and used it to pay for a hotel room right in the heart of downtown Chicago.
She was in a very posh hotel on Rush Street in a room with a bunch of her friends drinking and carrying on.
But Sheila had immediately caught wind of the party in progress when she saw the pictures that Heather and her friends were posting on social media.
There was alcohol, and her mother was very concerned.
Sheila quickly realized that Heather had booked the room using her credit card and decided to put a swift end to her daughter's disobedience.
She called the police. The police came up and they arrested Heather and Tommy Schaefer.
Sheila had hoped her daughter learned her lesson, but it was now clear that Heather had once again disobeyed her and brought Tommy out to join them on their trip.
There's no way he paid for this astronomically expensive ticket to Bali. And so Sheila immediately knows Heather went behind her back and used her credit card without her permission.
As the argument grew louder, they began to attract the attention of other guests and staff. Heather seemed embarrassed by the scene her mother was making.
Heather kept saying, "Mom, can we please go back to the room? Can we please go back to our room?"
Eventually, all three of them leave the lobby and they go upstairs to work on things privately.
For police, the night clerk's story raised more questions than it answered. Did this mean Heather and her boyfriend were both missing? Or both suspects?
What happened to these other two American tourists? How can we find them and find out if they're safe, for one, and two, if they know what happened to Sheila?
Either way, they're probably the last people who saw Sheila Mack alive.
But then the night clerk revealed another disturbing detail. Shortly after Sheila, Heather, and Tommy went upstairs together, Heather had returned to the lobby with an odd request.
Heather had appeared in search of duct tape.
The suitcase with her mother's body in it had been wrapped with duct tape.
That raised an eyebrow as to what happened.
Heather and Tommy had just moved to the top of investigators' list of suspects. To confirm their suspicions, Bali police requested the night's recordings from the hotel's video surveillance system.
There was dozens of security cameras around this hotel.
Detectives studied footage from dozens of cameras, starting with the ones outside the rooms of Sheila and Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer.
Tommy was on the 6th floor, Heather and her mother were on the 3rd floor.
The video footage showed that following the lobby confrontation, Sheila and Heather went back to their suite, while Tommy returned to his room. But less than an hour later, police saw Tommy leave again.
We see him get in the elevator and go to the 3rd floor and enter the room.
Heather answered the door, and soon after Tommy went inside, the camera showed the couple making several trips between their two hotel suites.
We see Heather and Tommy going back and forth between the 3rd floor and the 6th floor.
Just going up and down the stairs between the two rooms.
But what were they doing?
Sometime before noon, Heather and Tommy emerged with a luggage cart loaded with a large suitcase that was partially open, that had a white sheet tied around it.
The suitcase was a match for the one Sheila's body had been stuffed into.
Investigators immediately searched Tommy's room and realized something appeared to be missing.
They found out that a large fruit bowl was missing from his hotel room.
It was a bowl, similar to the one police believed had been used as the murder weapon. But while all signs pointed to Heather and Tommy as the killers, investigators still had no idea why. In order to find out, investigators would first have to track the young lovers down. Looking for clues to their whereabouts, police once again turned to the hotel's security cameras.
The cameras show Heather and Tommy loading the suitcase into a cab, and then they make a break for it.
There was some surveillance footage of them jumping a wall.
The cameras showed the couple crossing a street in front of the hotel and hailing a second cab. And from the direction the taxi headed, investigators suspected they knew where the couple might be going.
They're heading toward the airport.
Detectives knew that if Heather and Tommy were on the run, they most likely would be trying to get back to the U.S. But then, police discovered something inside the safe in Sheila's room that suggested that wouldn't be possible.
When they open the safe, bang, they find Heather's passport.
The police knew right away they couldn't leave the country. So that meant they're still in Indonesia.
Investigators knew that time was of the essence, so they enlisted the aid of the local media to help find the lovers.
Pretty soon, their pictures are everywhere on the news.
There was a manhunt.
On August 13th, the day after Sheila Mack's body was discovered, police got the break they needed. The owner of a low-budget motel contacted them about a young American couple who just checked in.
He calls them and said, the people you're looking for here.
Not only did the man recognize Heather and Tommy from their pictures on the news, they had checked in using their real names. But that wasn't the only surprising move the lovers made.
The couple had checked in at a hotel about 6 miles away using Sheila's stolen credit cards.
Investigators raced to the hotel and quickly found the lovers.
Police arrived and the couple were in their room sleeping.
As police placed Heather and Tommy under arrest, they couldn't help but wonder, why had the couple put so much planning into the murder, but so little thought into their escape plan? News of Sheila's death and the arrest of her own daughter sent shockwaves all the way back to Chicago.
I thought I was going to faint. I couldn't believe that my sister was gone.
Our kids were on their phone and pulling up articles. It's all over the internet already. We're all just like, how can this happen?
But as horrifying as Sheila's brutal murder had been, no one could have predicted the stunning twist this case was about to take. Coming up, Heather and Tommy professed their innocence while telling police a harrowing story.
They had been kidnapped by a gang for ransom.
And investigators make a startling discovery that suggests another motive for Sheila's murder.
She told them that she had at least $11 million.
Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer were a pair of rebellious young lovers willing to do anything to be together, including use her mother's credit card to sneak him out to Bali to see her.
All of us remember that first love relationship. It is not a time that most teenagers are really stopping to think through the consequences of their actions.
But now it appeared the lovers might have had something far more sinister than just credit card theft on their minds. Bali police had found the dead body of Heather's mother, 62-year-old Sheila Von Wies Mack, stuffed into a suitcase outside their luxury hotel. And security video pointed to Heather and Tommy as the prime suspects.
We know that Tommy and Heather brought the suitcase, placed it in a taxi cab. We know that they disappeared shortly after.
On August 13th, detectives arrested the lovers at a nearby motel and took them in for questioning.
No cameras. Oh my God.
To investigators' surprise, both Heather and Tommy seemed willing to talk.
Tommy and Heather were cooperative with authorities.
But what the couple had to say took investigators by surprise.
They said they had actually been kidnapped by a gang for ransom.
Investigators were skeptical, although they knew that certain dangers did lurk outside the walls of Bali's posh resorts.
This upscale resort area is really protected and insulated.
You get a few miles outside the resorts, and it's a different story, especially for tourists with money.
Tommy and Heather claimed the gang had kidnapped all three of them. Fearing for their lives, they had plotted and escaped. But when they put their plan into action, it had gone terribly wrong.
Heather and Tommy escaped, but Sheila was unable to. and they killed Sheila.
What they said is they checked into a cheap motel to hide from their abductors.
But what Heather and Tommy didn't know was that investigators had them on tape, getting rid of her mother's body.
They started out with a lie that was so preposterous. Did they really think people would believe that's what happened when they're the ones that put the bloodied suitcase in the taxi?
Realizing he'd been caught in the lie, Tommy admitted that they hadn't been kidnapped. But the new story he told them was even more shocking. Tommy started by telling police how he'd ended up in Bali in the first place. Just like Sheila had suspected, Heather had flown Tommy out to Bali with her mother's credit card. But Tommy said the visit was still supposed to be a surprise. Not for Heather, but for Sheila. So he and Heather could surprise her with some very special news.
Tommy flew over to Indonesia to share the news with Sheila that Heather was pregnant. They initially thought that they would present this to her while on this beautiful vacation in this tranquil space.
But Tommy told police their surprise had gotten off to a bad start when Sheila found Heather missing from their suite. When she spotted the lovers in the lobby at 3 a.m., Sheila was outraged. After their loud confrontation in the lobby, Sheila and Heather had gone back to their suite. Tommy said he went to his room, but he was worried. Sheila, he claimed, had seemed so angry that he became concerned about leaving Heather alone with her.
Tommy said that he was scared and that he believed that Heather's life and the life of their unborn child was in danger.
And when he went to the suite to check on his girlfriend, Tommy's worst fears were confirmed.
Sheila's furious. She's insulting Tommy, she's insulting Heather. Heather and Tommy are feeling attacked.
To try to defuse the situation, Tommy told her about the baby. But all that did was make matters worse.
When Sheila heard that her daughter was pregnant, that was the last thing she wanted to hear.
In fact, Tommy claimed that Sheila had gone from hurling insults to physically assaulting him.
She became enraged, called him a racial slur, and essentially attacked him.
Tommy said Heather had screamed for her mother to stop. He didn't want to hurt Sheila, but he was losing consciousness.
He felt himself beginning to pass out.
At that point, Tommy told police he grabbed the fruit bowl to defend himself.
Tommy reacted in self-defense and wound up battering her to death.
The next thing he knew, Sheila was dead. He and Heather both panicked. They were afraid no one would believe them, so they decided to get rid of the body.
They were terrified and were trying to figure out what to do.
They collapsed Sheila's body into a suitcase. Heather sat on the suitcase to close it.
This time, Tommy's story matched up with the evidence. And a pregnancy test confirmed that Heather was pregnant. But had Sheila's murder truly been in self-defense? Or were the lovers still concealing what really happened? Indonesian police weren't the only ones concerned about what happened to Sheila. Back in Chicago, the FBI had also taken interest in the case.
They had a murder, 2 American nationals murdering another American national in a foreign country.
When FBI investigators spoke with family members, they discovered that Sheila had problems with Tommy long before the trip to Bali. After Heather started dating Tommy, her drinking and partying had gotten worse, and Sheila saw him as someone who enabled her self-destructive lifestyle. So Sheila put her foot down. She took away Heather's car keys, her phone, and her credit cards. Sheila also forbade Heather from seeing Tommy Schaefer anymore.
Tough love is hard to do. She thought he was trouble, and she didn't want her to continue to see him.
But after agents searched Heather and Tommy's computer and text records, They discovered that even though Sheila had confiscated Heather's phone, she and Tommy had still been able to keep in contact through email and the internet.
So investigators in the United States began looking into online messages, emails between Tommy and Heather.
And it seemed the couple's favorite topic of conversation was fantasizing about the day they could finally be together without Sheila's interference. A day that Heather insisted would be possible when she finally got access to the trust fund her late father had left for her.
She told him that, she had at least $11 million.
Heather told Tommy she had to wait until she was 21 to get the money, which was still 2 years away. But then the lovers realized there was one way they could get the money sooner and get rid of Sheila for good.
If Heather's mother is out of the picture, she inherits the entire estate.
And that's when the couple's emails showed they'd stopped fantasizing and started brainstorming.
They had plotted out strategies. I said, let's make it look like a drowning. Let's make it look like a suicide.
Heather and Tommy wanted Sheila gone. They wanted her eliminated from their life.
When Sheila planned the trip to Bali, the couple finally saw their chance. Heather used her mother's credit card to purchase a plane ticket for Tommy. While on vacation, Sheila had given Heather her phone back. And according to Heather's text messages, she and Tommy still hadn't figured out how to kill Sheila.
About 40 minutes before the attack, they plot out their strategy. They called each other Bonnie and Clyde.
They're just trading text messages back and forth constantly, talking about what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they're going to achieve it, when's the best time to do it.
Eventually, the couple decided to make it look like Sheila fell and hit her head in a tragic accident. And Tommy had found a weapon he hoped would do the trick.
Tommy even sends Heather a picture of a decorative fruit dish and with a heavy metal handle and says, do you think this is heavy enough?
Learning about that text message brought something to mind for detectives. They decided to review the hotel's security footage from the night Sheila was killed and noticed Tommy acting strangely as he crept out of his room.
We see Tommy emerging from his bedroom with something hidden underneath his t-shirt.
And they believed that something was the decorative fruit bowl Tommy had used as a murder weapon. For the FBI, the hotel security footage and the lovers' text messages proved one thing for certain. Sheila's murder wasn't an act of self-defense.
This was a premeditated murder.
The FBI coordinated with Bali police, who charged the lovers with murder. Coming up, the lovers find themselves at the mercy of an Indonesian court and face potentially dire consequences.
It was in the paper that both Tommy and Heather, with premeditated murder, could face the firing squad.
But will justice be served, or will Heather's pregnancy sway the court's opinion and put the couple's fate in doubt? When 19-year-old Heather Mack fell in love with aspiring hip-hop artist Tommy Schaefer, she thought she'd finally found the man who could fill the void her late father left behind. And she planned to support both their lives together with a sizable trust fund her father had left her.
She told him that, she had at least $11 million.
This was a trust fund that Heather was going to have access to when she turned 21.
But investigators believed the couple couldn't stand waiting until Heather was 21, nor could they bear putting up with the judgment and interference from her disapproving mother, Sheila. So they murdered her while on vacation in Bali.
They killed Sheila, put her in a suitcase.
They both were charged with murder, and they were facing death by a firing squad in Bali.
A possible death sentence wasn't the only surprise in store. It turns out that neither Heather nor Tommy would have their fate decided by a jury.
In Indonesia, they don't have a jury system like us.
Instead, they hold a kind of tribunal. 3 judges hear the case and give their decision.
In January of 2015, Tommy and Heather, who was now 7 months pregnant, appeared before the Bali court. As news cameras rolled inside the courtroom, both lovers stuck by the story they told police.
Both Tommy and Heather, in tearful testimony, claimed self-defense.
But prosecutors argued that the couple planned to kill Sheila so Heather could inherit her father's estate. In court proceedings spanning over the next 2 months, prosecutors outlined their case against the couple. But the trial came to an abrupt halt in March of 2015 when Heather suddenly went into labor.
In March of 2015, Heather gives birth to her daughter.
2 weeks later, Heather and Tommy's trial reconvened, and the 3-judge panel announced they were ready to make their decision.
They found that Tommy was guilty of premeditated murder and that Heather had aided and abetted in that murder.
No one was surprised that the couple had been found guilty, but it was their sentences that grabbed headlines from Bali to Chicago. The couple wasn't sentenced to death by firing squad. What they got instead were shockingly light prison sentences.
Heather was sentenced to 10 years, and Tommy was sentenced to 18 years in prison.
The Indonesian court cited the birth of Heather's daughter as a motivating factor in their decision. According to the judges who handed down the sentence, it was unfair for Heather's daughter to grow up without a mother.
The sentence was shocking. The family of the victim was outraged.
We were devastated. They give somebody with premeditated murder a 10-year sentence. It just doesn't seem to be justice for Sheila.
Under Indonesian law, Heather has been allowed to keep her baby Stella with her in prison until she turns 2. Images of the teen mom cradling her newborn inside her prison cell have made international headlines. They're difficult images for Sheila Mack's sister and brother to look at. On the one hand, they can't help but feel sorry for their niece and her baby. But that sympathy is hard to reconcile with their anger over Heather's decision to murder her own mother because of her obsession with a boyfriend she refused to give up.
I thought I knew my niece. I knew there was trouble. It's really hard to grapple with that.
And you wonder what was going through her mind as she's being beaten to death, and if she sees her daughter and what she's thinking. It is just such betrayal.
A betrayal that Sheila's family will be struggling with for years to come.
I just didn't, lose my sister and best friend. I really lost my niece, too. It's another heartbreak, and I have to live the rest of my life with.
For most people, Hawaii exists in the imagination as a place untouched by the anxieties of the mainland United States. It is remembered through images of turquoise water stretching endlessly toward the horizon, volcanic mountains rising above dense tropical forests, quiet neighborhoods where generations of families know one another, and a pace of life that seems deliberately slower than anywhere else in America. News headlines from Hawaii rarely revolve around violence. Instead, they speak of tourism, surfing competitions, cultural festivals, and breathtaking landscapes. For decades, the islands cultivated a reputation as one of the safest places in the country, a place where the word paradise did not feel like an exaggeration, but a reasonable description of everyday life. That reputation made what happened on the morning of November 2nd, 1999, all the more difficult to comprehend. In just a matter of minutes, inside an ordinary office building belonging to Xerox Corporation on Nimitz Highway in Honolulu, 7 people were killed. They were not strangers gathered in a public square. They were not victims of a robbery gone wrong or passengers caught in random violence. They were co-workers, people who had shared hallways, meetings, lunch breaks, routine conversations, and years of professional life together. By the time police arrived, Hawaii had become the scene of the deadliest mass murder in its modern history. The tragedy would forever be remembered as the Xerox murders or the 1999 Honolulu shootings. Even today, more than 2 decades later, the case continues to be discussed whenever experts examine workplace violence. because it raises a question that is as unsettling now as it was then. How can an ordinary workplace, filled with familiar faces and everyday routines, suddenly become the setting for unimaginable violence? The answer, as investigators would later discover, was neither simple nor comforting. There was no single explosive argument that morning. There was no dramatic confrontation witnessed by dozens of employees. There was no sudden emotional breakdown observed moments before the first shots were fired. Instead, what unfolded appeared to be the devastating culmination of tensions that had existed beneath the surface for years. The man responsible was 40-year-old Byron Koji Wayasugi, a Xerox technician who had worked alongside many of the people he would ultimately kill. His name would soon appear in headlines across the United States. But before that morning, he had been known only to his family, his neighbors, and the co-workers who crossed paths with him during the normal rhythm of daily work. Like many employees, he arrived at the office each day wearing the familiar identity of someone simply doing his job. Yet behind that ordinary routine, investigators would later uncover a history of growing isolation, increasing resentment, and deep suspicion toward the people around him. Those who knew him described a man who had become increasingly withdrawn over the years. He was considered technically capable in his work repairing photocopiers and office equipment, but his relationships inside the company had deteriorated. Co-workers noticed his temper. Some described him as difficult to approach. Others sensed an undercurrent of hostility. According to accounts gathered after the shooting, Wayasugi believed that colleagues were working against him and intentionally making his professional life more difficult. Whether those beliefs reflected reality or existed only in his own perception would become one of the central questions surrounding the case. His family would later speak of a serious automobile accident earlier in his life that reportedly resulted in a head injury and noticeable changes in his personality. However, investigators never established that injury as the direct cause of what occurred on November 2nd. The tragedy resisted simple explanations. It refused to fit neatly into a single narrative of mental illness, workplace conflict, or personal grievance. Instead, it became a painful reminder that human behavior can rarely be reduced to one clear cause. The building on Nimitz Highway did not appear remarkable from the outside. It was a workplace like thousands of others spread across the country. Employees arrived each morning expecting another ordinary day of service calls, equipment repairs, paperwork, meetings, and conversations about schedules and customers. The technicians working there specialized in maintaining Xerox machines used by businesses throughout Honolulu. Their work demanded technical skill, patience, and coordination with fellow employees. It was not the type of workplace anyone associated with extraordinary danger. The familiarity of the environment would become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Violence did not erupt in an unfamiliar place. It entered a space built upon routine, predictability, and trust. On the morning of November 2nd, nothing suggested that history was about to change. Employees came to work expecting deadlines rather than disaster. They greeted co-workers they had seen countless times before. The building functioned as it always had. Yet somewhere within that routine, one employee arrived carrying a Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol chambered in 9mm ammunition. According to the subsequent investigation, there was no evidence that he acted impulsively in a sudden emotional outburst. Instead, authorities concluded that he appeared to have selected his targets before the shooting began. That conclusion would profoundly shape both the criminal investigation and the legal proceedings that followed. The speed of the attack added another layer of horror. In only a few minutes, 7 lives were taken. Ronald Kawami, Jason Baladico, Melvin Lee, Peter Mark, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, and John Sakamoto would never return home from work that day. Their names would become permanently connected to one of the darkest moments in Hawaii's history. Yet before the tragedy, they had simply been employees going about another ordinary Tuesday morning. They were fathers, sons, husbands, relatives, friends, and colleagues whose lives extended far beyond the office walls where they died. Their absence would leave lasting wounds not only within their families, but throughout the wider community. Hawaii's sense of security was shaken in a way few could have imagined. News of the shooting spread rapidly across the islands. Residents struggled to reconcile the image of Hawaii as a peaceful refuge with the reality unfolding inside a familiar office building in Honolulu. As police searched for the gunman, uncertainty replaced routine. Questions emerged faster than answers. Why had these particular employees been targeted? Could the violence have been prevented? Had warning signs been overlooked? Those questions would follow investigators throughout the months ahead and continue to shape discussions about workplace safety long after the trial had concluded. Yet before detectives reconstructed timelines, before attorneys argued inside a courtroom, and before experts debated warning signs and workplace violence, there was only the reality of that Tuesday morning, a morning that began like countless others and ended with 7 families receiving the kind of phone call no family should ever have to answer. This is not merely the story of a gunman or a criminal trial. It is the story of an ordinary workplace whose routine was shattered forever, of co-workers whose lives ended without warning, and of a community forced to confront the unimaginable within a place it had long believed was insulated from such violence. To understand how Hawaii experienced the deadliest mass shooting in its modern history, we must first step back from the violence itself and examine the people, the workplace, and the quiet tensions that existed long before the first shot was ever fired. Long before the Xerox building on Nimitz Highway became a crime scene, it was simply a workplace defined by routine. Every morning, employees arrived with schedules to follow, equipment to repair, customer requests to answer, and coworkers they expected to see throughout another ordinary day. The office was part of Xerox Corporation's service operations in Honolulu, supporting businesses that depended on photocopiers, printers, and other office technology to keep their own work running smoothly. The technicians assigned to this location were responsible for diagnosing mechanical problems, replacing worn components, performing maintenance, and traveling to customer sites when machines malfunctioned. It was technical work that demanded patience, consistency, and cooperation. Although each technician often worked independently while servicing equipment, they remained connected through daily meetings, shared responsibilities, and the practical realities of working within the same department. Like many workplaces, the Xerox office functioned through familiarity. Employees recognized one another's habits. They understood who specialized in certain repairs, who preferred working quietly, who enjoyed conversation during breaks, and who could be relied upon for assistance when difficult technical problems arose. Years of working together created relationships that extended beyond professional necessity. Some employees had known each other for a significant portion of their careers. They attended meetings together, exchanged routine greetings each morning, and expected that tomorrow would look much like yesterday. Nothing about the office suggested it would one day become associated with one of the darkest chapters in Hawaii's modern history. Among those employees was Byron Koji Wayasugi. Born in Honolulu in 1959, Wayasugi grew up in Hawaii as part of a Japanese-American family. Unlike public figures whose lives unfold under constant attention, very little about his early years attracted public interest before the events of November 1999. He completed his education and eventually entered the technical field, developing the skills that would later earn him employment with Xerox. By all available accounts contained within the known record, he was considered capable in his work. Repairing complex office machines requires both technical knowledge and attention to detail, and Wayasugi spent years performing those responsibilities. On paper, his career resembled that of countless other technicians working throughout the country. He reported to work, repaired equipment, interacted with supervisors and co-workers, and participated in the daily rhythm of an ordinary business operation. Yet careers are not defined solely by technical ability. Workplaces are communities as much as they are organizations, And successful employment depends not only on completing assigned tasks, but also on maintaining professional relationships. Over time, coworkers began noticing aspects of Wayasugi's behavior that distinguished him from many of the people around him. He was frequently described as quiet and reserved. Remaining private is not unusual in itself, and many employees naturally prefer limited social interaction. However, descriptions gathered after the shooting suggested that his isolation gradually became more pronounced. Rather than simply being a quiet coworker, he increasingly appeared detached from the broader social environment of the office. Employees observed that he often kept to himself and rarely engaged beyond what his work required. Standing alone, such behavior would not necessarily alarm anyone. Every workplace includes individuals with different personalities, communication styles, and preferences for social interaction. What drew greater attention was the combination of isolation with growing anger and distrust. According to people who knew him, Wayasugi became increasingly convinced that fellow employees were working against him. He believed coworkers intentionally created obstacles for him or sought to make his work more difficult. These perceptions influenced how he interpreted everyday interactions inside the office. Whether dealing with supervisors, fellow technicians, or routine workplace disagreements, he increasingly viewed events through a lens of suspicion. Investigators later documented these reported beliefs, but they found no evidence establishing that a coordinated effort actually existed against him. That distinction would remain important throughout discussions of the case. The available information reflects Wayasugi's reported perceptions rather than verified actions by those around him. For his coworkers, however, the underlying reasons mattered less than the visible changes in his demeanor. They observed a man who seemed increasingly withdrawn and increasingly resentful. Family members later contributed another piece to the public understanding of Wayasugi's life. They stated that years earlier he had been involved in an automobile accident that resulted in a head injury. According to their recollections, they noticed changes in his personality following that incident. Such statements naturally prompted questions about whether the injury played any role in the events that unfolded years later. However, investigators and the legal process never established a direct causal connection between the earlier accident and the November 1999 shooting. The existence of the injury formed part of the broader background surrounding Wayasugi's life, but it did not become a definitive explanation for the crimes. The case ultimately resisted simple answers. Human behavior, particularly acts of extreme violence, rarely emerges from a single, identifiable event. The inability to isolate one clear cause became one of the enduring challenges in understanding the Xerox murders. As the years passed, relationships within the Xerox office continued to evolve. While many employees carried on with their responsibilities, reports indicated that Wayasugi's interactions with others grew increasingly strained. Workplace disagreements are common in almost every profession. Deadlines create stress. Supervisors evaluate performance. Coworkers occasionally misunderstand one another. Most conflicts remain temporary and are resolved through ordinary communication. In Wayasugi's case, however, available accounts suggest that tensions accumulated rather than diminished. He reportedly became more convinced that others treated him unfairly. That perception shaped how he viewed both routine workplace decisions and the people responsible for making them. Despite these growing concerns, the office continued functioning. Machines still required repair. Customers still expected service. Meetings continued according to schedule. The ordinary nature of daily operations may have made it difficult for anyone to imagine that underlying resentment could eventually lead to catastrophic violence. Hindsight often creates the illusion that warning signs were unmistakable. Yet reality is rarely so straightforward. Individuals can display frustration, anger, or social withdrawal without ever becoming violent. Coworkers may notice personality changes while reasonably believing that such matters belong within the boundaries of ordinary workplace conflict rather than impending tragedy. This distinction would become especially significant after November 2nd, when many people searched for clues that might explain what had happened. Before the shooting, however, employees simply worked alongside someone whose behavior had gradually become more difficult, but whose future actions remained unimaginable. The people who would later become victims did not know that history would remember them because of a single morning. They were professionals with responsibilities extending far beyond the office walls. Every workday represented another opportunity to complete assignments, support customers, and eventually return home to their families. Their identities cannot be reduced to the tragedy that later defined public memory. They were individuals whose ordinary routines happened to intersect with someone who's growing. Isolation and resentment would ultimately have devastating consequences. At this stage in the story, nothing irreversible had yet occurred. The Xerox office remained what it had always been, a workplace where technicians repaired machines, supervisors managed schedules, and employees prepared for another normal day. Yet beneath that familiar routine, relationships had become increasingly strained for one member of the staff. The distrust that had gradually taken root in Byron Wayasugi's perception of his workplace would continue to deepen during the years leading up to November 1999. Those unresolved tensions, still largely confined to disagreements and perceptions rather than acts of violence, would soon move beyond the boundaries of ordinary workplace conflict. The next chapter would examine how those divisions became more visible, how concerns about Wayasugi's behavior began to emerge more clearly, and how a series of warning signs, none of which seemed to predict mass murder on their own, formed the background to one of the deadliest workplace shootings in American history. By the final years of the 1990s, the Xerox service office in Honolulu continued to operate much as it always had. Technicians reported to work, prepared for service calls, attended meetings, and maintained the equipment relied upon by businesses throughout the city. From the outside, nothing distinguished the office from countless other workplaces where employees spent years building careers through ordinary routines. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, one employee's relationship with the organization and the people around him had grown increasingly strained. The change did not happen overnight, nor was it defined by a single dramatic confrontation. Instead, according to the information later examined by investigators, it developed gradually through a pattern of growing distrust, resentment, and isolation. Byron Koji Wayasugi was still employed as a Xerox technician, still responsible for repairing office equipment, and still sharing the workplace with colleagues he had known for years. His technical abilities were not the primary issue attracting attention. Rather, concerns centered on his interactions with other people. Coworkers increasingly viewed him as someone who became angry easily and who appeared convinced that others were treating him unfairly. While disagreements occasionally occur in any workplace, the accounts surrounding Wayasugi suggested that he interpreted many situations through a belief that fellow employees were intentionally making his job more difficult. According to those familiar with him, he increasingly believed that coworkers were working against him. Such beliefs influenced the way he perceived everyday events. A routine workplace decision, an assignment, or a disagreement that another employee might have viewed as an ordinary part of the job could instead reinforce Wayasugi's growing conviction that he was being singled out. Importantly, investigators did not establish evidence supporting the existence of an organized effort by coworkers to undermine him. The available record consistently distinguishes between Wayasugi's reported perceptions and independently verified facts. Nevertheless, perceptions, even when unsupported by objective evidence, can profoundly influence how a person responds to the world around them. As those perceptions deepened, so too did the emotional distance between Wayasugi and many of the people with whom he worked each day. His isolation became more apparent. Employees described him as increasingly withdrawn, communicating only when necessary and rarely participating in the informal social interactions that naturally develop among coworkers over years of working together. Offices often develop their own culture built upon shared experiences, casual conversations, and mutual familiarity. Those connections may appear insignificant in isolation, yet they create a sense of belonging that helps define a workplace community. Reports suggest that Wayasugi gradually separated himself from that community. Instead of feeling connected to the people around him, he appeared to see himself as standing apart from them. Alongside that growing isolation came episodes that attracted greater concern. At one point during his employment, Wayasugi became involved in an incident significant enough that Xerox required him to participate in an anger management program. This detail later became one of the most discussed aspects of his employment history because it demonstrated that concerns regarding his behavior had emerged before the shooting. The requirement did not arise because of technical performance, but because of an episode in which he reportedly lost his temper at work. Although the available factual record does not describe every detail of that incident, it establishes that the company considered the behavior serious enough to warrant intervention through anger management measures. From today's perspective, it is easy to view that requirement as an unmistakable warning sign. Yet hindsight often creates clarity that was unavailable to those living through events in real time. Employers regularly address conflicts between employees, encourage counseling, or require participation in workplace programs intended to improve communication and emotional regulation. The overwhelming majority of individuals who complete such programs never commit acts of violence. At the time, those around Wayasugi had no way of knowing that the concerns being addressed would later become part of the background to a mass shooting. Instead, the anger management requirement represented one attempt to respond to visible workplace tension using the tools available within a professional environment. For coworkers, however, the incident reinforced an impression that something had changed. They increasingly recognized a pattern of hostility that extended beyond isolated disagreements. Some employees reportedly felt uncomfortable around Wayasugi. Others noticed that he seemed persistently resentful. Still, discomfort is not the same as predicting violence. Most people who worked alongside him continued their daily routines without believing that their colleague might one day bring a firearm into the office. The office itself offered little reason to expect such an outcome. Xerox remained a place devoted to servicing business equipment, not a location associated with danger. Meetings continued, repair schedules remained full, and technicians focused on the practical demands of their work. One figure who occupied a particularly important place in Wayasugi's perception of the workplace was his supervisor, Melvin Lee. Lee had worked at Xerox for many years and served in a supervisory capacity over technicians, including Wayasugi. According to the information later presented after the shooting, Wayasugi came to view Lee as representing many of the frustrations he associated with his employment. Reports indicated that Lee became one of the individuals Wayasugi blamed for what he believed were unfair circumstances within the workplace. It is essential to distinguish between documented facts and personal interpretation. The evidence establishes that Wayasugi harbored resentment toward Lee, but it does not establish that Lee engaged in wrongdoing. Rather, the available record indicates that Lee became, in Wayasugi's mind, a symbol of the problems he believed existed around him. That distinction is important because the case is not a story of verified abuse by supervisors or documented persecution within the workplace. Instead, it reflects the tragic consequences that can emerge when one individual's perception of reality diverges sharply from the experiences of those around him. To coworkers, Melvin Lee was a longtime supervisor performing his professional responsibilities. To Wayasugi, he reportedly represented something far different. This gap between perception and objective evidence became one of the defining features of the case. As months passed, those differences remained unresolved. No single event appears to have transformed ordinary workplace conflict into imminent violence. Instead, dissatisfaction accumulated gradually. The routine of daily work continued, but beneath that routine, one employee's resentment persisted. Family members would later recall that Wayasugi seemed increasingly convinced that he had been wronged by those around him. Co-workers observed his distance and occasional hostility, but they continued to see him as part of the same workplace they entered every morning. There were no public declarations of violent intent contained within the factual record provided. There were no dramatic confrontations immediately preceding the attack. Instead, investigators would later conclude that the violence appeared targeted, suggesting that Wayasugi had already identified specific individuals before arriving at work on November 2, 1999. That conclusion would become especially significant because every person killed during the attack was someone with whom he worked. They were not random members of the public. They were familiar faces encountered through years of shared employment. Looking back after the tragedy, observers naturally search for moments when events might have unfolded differently. Questions arose about whether greater intervention could have changed the outcome, whether workplace tensions had been underestimated, or whether warning signs had gone unrecognized. Those questions remain difficult precisely because the available facts resist simple conclusions. Isolation alone does not predict violence. Anger alone does not predict violence. Workplace disagreements are common, and participation in anger management programs, while serious, does not ordinarily foreshadow mass murder. The tragedy at Xerox emerged from a combination of circumstances that, taken individually, might not have appeared extraordinary, but collectively formed the background to an unimaginable act. As October gave way to November, daily life inside the Xerox office continued much as it always had. Employees planned upcoming service appointments, attended meetings, and prepared for another ordinary Tuesday. None of the 7 men who would lose their lives knew that they were approaching the final days of routines they had followed for years. They continued working beside colleagues they trusted, expecting that another workday would end with the familiar journey home. Even among those who recognized that Wayasugi had become increasingly isolated and resentful, there was no expectation that those emotions would soon erupt into the deadliest workplace shooting Hawaii had ever experienced. On the morning of November 2, 1999, that illusion of ordinary routine would disappear forever. Within minutes, a workplace built on years of shared professional experience would become a crime scene, and the quiet tensions that had developed over time would culminate in irreversible violence. The next chapter begins on that Tuesday morning, when Byron Wayasugi arrived at the Xerox office carrying far more than the tools of his profession. Tuesday, November 2, 1999, began like countless other mornings in Honolulu. The city was waking to another ordinary workday as commuters made their way along familiar roads and businesses prepared to open their doors. Employees across the island followed routines they had repeated hundreds of times before, expecting meetings, deadlines, repairs, paperwork, and the quiet predictability that defines so much of working life. At the Xerox service office located at 1200 North Nimitz Highway, there was no indication that this day would become one of the darkest in Hawaii's modern history. Technicians arrived prepared to continue servicing office equipment used by businesses throughout Honolulu. The building itself looked no different than it had the day before. The parking area filled with employees arriving for work, conversations were exchanged in passing, and another day appeared to be unfolding according to routine. Among those arriving that morning was 40-year-old Xerox technician Byron Koji Wayasugi. To the people who saw him enter the building, there was no immediate public confrontation or dramatic scene announcing what was about to happen. According to the subsequent investigation, he carried with him a Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol chambered in 9mm ammunition. Investigators later concluded that there was no indication he was acting in a sudden panic or emotional outburst at the moment he entered the workplace. Instead, evidence suggested that the attack had been directed towards specific co-workers. This conclusion would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Unlike attacks in which victims are chosen randomly from whoever happens to be nearby, the Xerox shooting appeared focused on individuals with whom Wayasugi had worked. Shortly before 8 o'clock that morning, employees inside the building continued their ordinary responsibilities. Some prepared for service assignments while others attended to administrative tasks. Meetings were expected as part of the regular work schedule. Nothing in those final quiet moments warned the victims that the ordinary rhythm of the office was about to end forever. Wayasugi made his way to the second floor, where technicians were working. The atmosphere remained routine. Co-workers who encountered him had known him through years of shared employment. They had worked beside him during countless ordinary days, and there was no reason to believe this morning would be different. Within moments, however, the familiar environment transformed into a scene of unimaginable violence. Without any warning described in the available factual record, Wayasugi drew the Glock pistol and opened fire. The first victim was Ronald Kawami, 54 years old. Kawami had spent years working alongside the people surrounding him that morning. Like everyone else in the office, he had come to work expecting another ordinary Tuesday. Instead, he became the first person fatally shot during the attack. The sudden sound of gunfire shattered the normal activity inside the building. Before many employees could fully understand what was happening, another coworker became a target. Jason Balatico, 33 years old, attempted to escape after the shooting began. Faced with an unexpected and rapidly unfolding attack, he tried to flee the danger. According to the available information, he was shot while attempting to get away and did not survive. His effort to escape illustrates one of the most tragic realities of workplace shootings. Events unfold so quickly that victims often have only seconds to react to circumstances they never imagined they would face. The attack had only just begun, yet 2 lives had already been lost. For employees elsewhere in the office, confusion spread almost instantly. Gunfire inside a workplace is so far removed from ordinary experience that the first moments are often marked by uncertainty. People struggle to understand what they are hearing and where the danger is located. In the Xerox office, there was little time for anyone to process the situation before more shots followed. Among those present during the opening moments of the attack was Randall Shin. Unlike the 7 men who would lose their lives, Shin survived. According to the information available, he managed to escape the building and later became one of the most important witnesses in reconstructing the beginning of the shooting. His account helped investigators establish how rapidly events unfolded and confirmed the sudden nature of the attack. The survival of a witness such as Shin became crucial because the people who had been directly targeted were no longer able to describe what had happened. As investigators later pieced together the sequence of events, testimony from survivors formed an essential part of understanding those first chaotic moments. By now, the office had been transformed from a place of routine employment into an active crime scene. Employees who were not directly in the line of fire faced impossible decisions within seconds. Some attempted to flee. Others sought safety wherever they could. The available factual record does not describe every individual movement inside the building, and it would be inappropriate to speculate beyond what investigators established. What is known is that the violence unfolded with extraordinary speed. There was no prolonged confrontation stretching over hours inside the office. The attack progressed from one area of the workplace to another within only a matter of minutes. After shooting Ronald Kawami and Jason Balatico, Wayasugi continued moving through the office. Investigators later concluded that his actions reflected an apparent selection of targets rather than indiscriminate violence. This distinction would remain central throughout both the investigation and the trial. Every victim was someone connected to his workplace, reinforcing the conclusion that the attack had not been directed toward random strangers. While panic spread through the building, emergency calls began reaching law enforcement. Employees who escaped or became aware of the gunfire contacted authorities to report an active shooting inside the Xerox office. For police dispatchers, the information arriving over emergency lines described an unfolding crisis unlike anything Hawaii had previously experienced on such a scale. Officers were immediately dispatched to the scene, but even the fastest response could not erase what had already occurred during those first devastating minutes. The victims inside the building had no warning, no opportunity to prepare, and little chance to comprehend the danger before it reached them. As officers raced toward the Xerox office, the attack itself continued. The workplace that had begun the morning with ordinary conversations and technical assignments had become a place where fear replaced familiarity almost instantly. Every hallway, office, and meeting space now carried uncertainty. Co-workers who had spent years together were suddenly separated by violence beyond anything they could have anticipated. Investigators would later determine that Wayasugi fired a total of 28 rounds during the attack. Although that figure captures the scale of the violence, numbers alone cannot convey the speed with which lives were forever changed. In only a few minutes, families across Honolulu unknowingly lost fathers, sons, husbands, brothers, relatives, friends, and colleagues. The attack demonstrated how quickly an ordinary morning could become an irreversible tragedy. For those outside the building, the full extent of what had happened was still unknown. Police responding to emergency calls could not immediately know how many victims were inside, whether the shooter remained in the building, or whether additional people were at risk. Such uncertainty is common during rapidly developing incidents, where information changes from minute to minute and responders must act without a complete picture. Inside the Xerox office, however, the consequences were already becoming tragically clear. The first phase of the attack had claimed 2 lives and left surviving employees struggling to escape or find safety. Yet the violence had not ended. Wayasugi continued toward another part of the office where several co-workers had gathered, and within moments the deadliest portion of the shooting would unfold. The meeting room ahead contained employees who had worked alongside him for years, individuals who had no reason to believe that an ordinary workday was about to become their last. What happened next would transform the Xerox office into the scene of the worst mass murder Hawaii had ever experienced and leave a lasting scar on a community that had long believed such violence belonged somewhere else. By the time Byron Koji Wayasugi moved away from the area where the first 2 victims had fallen, the Xerox office was already engulfed in confusion. The initial gunfire had shattered the ordinary rhythm of the workday, replacing routine with fear in only a matter of seconds. Employees who had not witnessed the beginning of the attack were suddenly confronted with sounds they struggled to understand. Some immediately recognized the unmistakable crack of gunfire, while others were left trying to determine what was happening inside a workplace that had never before been associated with such violence. Every passing second increased the uncertainty. People who only moments earlier had been thinking about service schedules, customer calls, or technical repairs were now focused on a single instinct: survival. According to the established facts of the case, Wayasugi did not stop after the first shootings. Instead, he continued deeper into the Xerox office, moving toward a meeting room where several employees were gathered. Investigators would later conclude that the victims were not chosen at random. Rather, they were all co-workers with whom Wayasugi had worked, reinforcing the belief that specific individuals had been selected before the attack began. This distinction separated the Xerox murders from acts of indiscriminate public violence. The victims were people connected through years of shared employment, daily interactions, and professional responsibility. The meeting room represented another ordinary part of the office environment. Meetings were a routine element of the technician's work, providing opportunities to discuss schedules, assignments, operational issues, and the practical demands of servicing Xerox equipment throughout Honolulu. There was nothing unusual about employees gathering there that morning. Like every other room in the building, it existed to support ordinary business operations. Yet within moments, it would become the primary scene of the deadliest portion of the attack. Inside the room were 5 men who had arrived expecting another normal workday. Melvin Lee, 58 years old, served as Wayasugi's supervisor and had spent many years working for Xerox. Peter Mark, 46, was another experienced employee whose career had become part of the daily routine of the service department. Ford Kanehira, 41, Ronald Kataoka, 50, and John Sakamoto, 36, completed the group gathered there. Each of them had families, friends, responsibilities, and lives extending far beyond the walls of the Xerox office. Yet on that Tuesday morning, they shared one circumstance they could never have anticipated. They were together in the meeting room as the attack reached its most devastating stage. According to investigators, Wayasugi entered the room and opened fire. The factual record establishes what occurred, but does not provide a second-by-second reconstruction of every movement made by each individual inside. It is therefore important to remain faithful to the evidence rather than speculate about actions that cannot be verified. What is known is that the shooting happened with extraordinary speed. Within only a few minutes from the beginning of the attack, all 7 victims, including the 2 men shot earlier, had been killed. The violence inside the meeting room accounted for the remaining 5 deaths that transformed the incident into the deadliest mass shooting in Hawaii's modern history. Later examination of the crime scene revealed another significant detail. Investigators determined that Wayasugi fired a total of 28 rounds during the attack. That number illustrates the intensity of the violence compressed into an incredibly brief period. 28 shots fired inside an office building changed the lives of countless families forever. Although statistics help document criminal events, they can never fully express the human reality behind them. Each round represented another irreversible moment, another life placed in immediate danger, another family unknowingly moving toward devastating news. One of the defining characteristics of the Xerox murders is how quickly everything unfolded. Mass casualty events often leave survivors describing time as distorted. Seconds seem impossibly long, while entire sequences of events pass in what later feels like an instant. In this case, investigators concluded that the attack lasted only a matter of minutes. There was no extended standoff inside the office, no prolonged exchange between victims and attacker, and no opportunity for meaningful intervention before the shooting had already claimed 7 lives. The speed of the violence left little chance for those targeted to react. Their ordinary workday was interrupted without warning, and within moments it had come to an irreversible end. Outside the meeting room, uncertainty continued to spread throughout the building. Employees elsewhere in the office could not immediately know where the shooter was located or whether additional victims would be targeted. Some sought safety, while others attempted to distance themselves from the gunfire. The available evidence confirms that Randall Shin escaped and later became an important witness. But the complete experience of every surviving employee is not fully documented within the factual record provided. What remains beyond dispute is that fear rapidly overtook the workplace. A building dedicated to servicing office equipment had become the setting for unprecedented violence. For law enforcement officers responding to emergency calls, the situation remained fluid and uncertain. Dispatchers received reports of an active shooter, but the precise circumstances inside the building were still unfolding. Responding officers could not yet know how many victims there were, whether the gunman remained inside, or whether additional attacks were imminent. Every emergency response begins with incomplete information, and the Xerox shooting was no exception. As police traveled toward the office, the tragedy had already reached its deadliest point. Inside the meeting room, 5 men had lost their lives alongside the 2 victims killed moments earlier. Their names would soon be released publicly: Ronald Kawami, Jason Balatico, Melvin Lee, Peter Mark, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, and John Sakamoto. Together, they represented far more than a list of victims. They represented decades of combined professional experience. Families waiting for loved ones to return home, friendships formed over years, and futures that ended without warning. One of the most painful aspects of the Xerox murders is that the victims were connected through familiarity rather than chance. They had worked alongside the man who killed them. They had shared the ordinary routines that define professional life: meetings, conversations, technical assignments, and countless days that passed without incident. That familiarity makes the violence particularly difficult to comprehend. Trust forms an invisible foundation within every workplace. Employees expect disagreements, deadlines, and occasional conflict, but they generally do not expect life-threatening danger from the people with whom they work. On November 2nd, 1999, that expectation was shattered. Investigators would later emphasize that the victims appeared to have been deliberately chosen, rather than encountered randomly. This conclusion reinforced the understanding that the attack reflected grievances rooted within the workplace itself rather than indiscriminate public violence. Yet even with that conclusion, many questions remained unanswered. Why had resentment developed to such an extreme level? Why had 7 co-workers become targets? Could anyone have recognized the danger before it reached this point? Those questions would remain central throughout the investigation and trial, though none would diminish the loss suffered by the victims' families. After the final shots were fired, an eerie silence settled over the Xerox office. Only minutes earlier, the building had echoed with the ordinary sounds of technicians preparing for another workday. Now it had become a crime scene marked by devastation. 7 employees lay dead. Surviving co-workers faced shock and disbelief as they struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. Outside, police units were arriving, emergency personnel were preparing to enter the building, and Honolulu was only beginning to realize that the peaceful image long associated with Hawaii had been irreversibly altered. The violence inside the office had ended almost as suddenly as it had begun, but the story itself was far from over. Byron Koji Wayasugi did not remain at the scene. Instead, after carrying out the attack, he left the building in a Xerox company van, setting in motion the next phase of the case, a citywide search that would culminate in a tense 5-hour standoff near the Hawaii Nature Center before one of the most consequential criminal investigations in the state's history could truly begin. When the gunfire inside the Xerox office finally stopped, the violence that had claimed 7 lives had lasted only a matter of minutes. Yet while the attack itself was over, the emergency was far from finished. For the surviving employees, uncertainty still dominated every decision. They did not immediately know whether the shooter had left the building, whether more victims had been injured in other parts of the office, or whether another round of violence was about to begin. The workplace that had started the morning with ordinary conversations and technical assignments had become a place defined by fear, confusion, and silence. Outside, emergency calls had already reached law enforcement, and police officers were racing toward the Xerox facility on North Nimitz Highway with only limited information about what they would encounter. Reports described an active shooting, but as is often the case during rapidly developing emergencies, many critical details remained unknown. Responding officers could not immediately determine how many people had been injured, whether the gunman was still inside the building, or whether additional civilians remained in immediate danger. Every minute mattered, yet every decision had to be made without a complete understanding of the situation. While officers moved toward the scene, Byron Koji Wayasugi was already leaving the Xerox office. According to the established facts of the case, he fled in a Xerox company van after carrying out the shootings. His departure transformed what had begun as an active crime scene into a large-scale search, extending beyond the office itself. Investigators no longer faced only the challenge of securing the building and assisting survivors. They also had to locate an armed suspect who remained in possession of a firearm and whose intentions were unknown. Because 7 people had already been killed, authorities had every reason to assume that he remained extremely dangerous. The possibility that additional violence could occur elsewhere could not be dismissed. As news of the shooting spread, law enforcement agencies mobilized quickly. Honolulu had rarely experienced an event of this magnitude, and the realization that the suspected gunman was still at large added urgency to every aspect of the response. Police began searching for the Xerox van while simultaneously coordinating emergency operations. Around the crime scene, the building itself required immediate attention. Officers needed to ensure there were no additional threats inside, identify the victims, assist survivors, and preserve evidence that would later become essential to the criminal investigation. At the same time, resources were directed toward locating the fleeing suspect before he could disappear or place more people at risk. For the community, information arrived gradually and often incompletely. Initial reports confirmed that a shooting had taken place at the Xerox office, but the full scale of the tragedy was not yet publicly understood. Families of employees anxiously waited for information, uncertain whether loved ones were safe or among those injured. Co-workers who had escaped the building struggled to process what they had witnessed. Many had begun the morning expecting nothing more unusual than another routine workday. Instead, they found themselves becoming witnesses to the deadliest mass murder in Hawaii's modern history. As the search expanded across Honolulu, investigators eventually located the Xerox van near the Hawaii Nature Center in the Makiki area above downtown Honolulu. The discovery marked an important turning point. Authorities had successfully found the suspect's vehicle, but the situation remained extremely dangerous. According to the factual record, Wayasugi remained inside the van and was still armed. Rather than ending with a quick arrest, the case entered a tense standoff that would last approximately 5 hours. Law enforcement officers immediately established a secure perimeter around the area. Every decision made during the next several hours reflected the need to balance public safety with the goal of resolving the confrontation peacefully. Officers knew they were dealing with a suspect believed responsible for killing 7 co-workers only hours earlier. They also knew he still possessed a firearm. These circumstances required careful planning and patience. Any unnecessary escalation could place officers, nearby civilians, or the suspect himself at greater risk. One detail added further urgency to the developing situation. According to the available information, a group of children was participating in an educational field trip near the Hawaii Nature Center. Their presence dramatically increased the stakes of the standoff. Authorities had to consider not only the immediate confrontation with Wayasugi, but also the safety of children located in the vicinity. The area was secured, and protective measures were implemented to ensure that those nearby were not exposed to additional danger. This aspect of the response illustrates how rapidly the consequences of one violent act can extend far beyond the original crime scene. What had begun inside an office building now affected emergency planning across another part of Honolulu as police worked to prevent further tragedy. During the hours that followed, negotiations became the primary strategy. Law enforcement officers sought a peaceful resolution while maintaining the security perimeter around the van. The factual record establishes that the confrontation lasted for approximately 5 hours before finally coming to an end. Unlike many dramatic portrayals of police standoffs in fiction, the available evidence does not include lengthy public conversations, dramatic exchanges, or detailed dialogue between negotiators and Wayasugi. It is therefore important not to invent scenes unsupported by the historical record. What is known is that officers remained committed to resolving the situation without additional bloodshed. Their patience ultimately proved successful. At approximately 3 o'clock that afternoon, Wayasugi surrendered to police and was taken into custody. His arrest ended one of the most traumatic days in Hawaii's modern history without further loss of life. The surrender also marked the beginning of another critical phase of the case. Until that moment, investigators had been responding to an unfolding emergency. Once the suspect was in custody, attention could shift toward establishing precisely what had happened inside the Xerox office. documenting the evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing the legal case that would eventually proceed to trial. For law enforcement personnel, the transition from emergency response to criminal investigation required meticulous work. Every detail of the crime scene needed to be preserved. Ballistic evidence would have to be examined. Witness statements would need to be collected while memories remained as fresh as possible. The identities of the victims had to be formally confirmed, and their families notified through official procedures. Although the public often remembers dramatic arrests, the investigative work that follows is equally essential. It forms the foundation upon which prosecutors later build their case in court. Meanwhile, the emotional consequences of the shooting continued to spread throughout Hawaii. Families learned that loved ones would never return home. Co-workers who had survived faced the difficult reality of having witnessed extraordinary violence in a place they had always considered safe. Xerox employees across the organization began grappling with the loss of colleagues who had shared years of professional life together. The office on Nimitz Highway was no longer simply a workplace. It had become a symbol of a tragedy that challenged long-held assumptions about safety in one of America's most peaceful states. News organizations throughout the country soon carried reports of the shootings, bringing national attention to Honolulu. For many outside Hawaii, the event seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the state's reputation. The contrast between paradise and mass violence became a recurring theme in media coverage. But for those directly affected, such comparisons offered little comfort. Their focus remained on the 7 men whose lives had ended that morning and the many questions that still awaited answers. Why had these particular co-workers been targeted? What had motivated the attack? Had warning signs existed before the shooting? Those questions would now become the responsibility of detectives tasked with reconstructing every stage of the case. With Wayasugi in custody, investigators could begin the painstaking process of separating confirmed facts from speculation. The crime scene inside the Xerox office witnessed testimony from survivors such as Randall Shin, physical evidence recovered during the investigation, and the chronology of the attack would all become central to understanding what had happened. The emergency phase had ended, but the search for explanation had only just begun. In the weeks ahead, detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and defense attorneys would each examine the evidence from different perspectives, attempting to understand how years of workplace tension had culminated in a few devastating minutes that forever changed Hawaii's history. With Byron Koji Wayasugi safely in police custody by the afternoon of November 2, 1999, the immediate danger had ended, but the work of understanding what had happened had only begun. The responsibility now shifted from emergency responders to investigators, whose task was not simply to identify the person responsible, but to establish a complete and accurate account of the events that had transformed an ordinary workplace into the scene of the deadliest mass murder in Hawaii's modern history. Every criminal investigation seeks to answer the same fundamental questions: what happened, how it happened, who was responsible, and why. In the Xerox murders, investigators already knew the identity of the suspect within hours of the attack. What remained was the painstaking process of documenting every piece of evidence, confirming every movement, identifying every victim, and ensuring that the facts presented in court would be supported by reliable evidence rather than speculation. The Xerox office on North Nimitz Highway became the center of that effort. Once officers confirmed the building was secure, investigators began a systematic examination of the crime scene. Every room connected to the attack required careful documentation. The locations where victims were found, the physical evidence left behind, and the path taken during the shooting all formed part of the reconstruction that would later be presented during legal proceedings. Crime scene investigators approached the office with meticulous attention to detail because every observation could become significant once the case entered the courtroom. Their objective was not to confirm assumptions, but to establish facts that could withstand legal scrutiny. Among the earliest priorities was the identification of the victims. Authorities formally confirmed that 7 Xerox employees had been killed during the attack. They were Jason Balatico, 33 years old, Melvin Lee, 58, Ford Kanehira, 41, Ronald Kataoka, 50, Ronald Kawami, 54, Peter Mark, 46, and John Sakamoto, 36. Although public attention naturally focused on the suspect, investigators understood that each victim represented an individual life rather than merely a statistic. Behind every name stood a family waiting for official confirmation, friends struggling to understand what had happened, and coworkers attempting to process the unimaginable loss of people they had worked beside for years. Throughout the investigation, the identities of the victims remained central to understanding the human cost of the tragedy. Physical evidence collected at the scene helped investigators establish the mechanics of the attack. One significant finding confirmed that Wayasugi had fired a total of 28 rounds during the shooting. That number aligned with the overall reconstruction of events and demonstrated the intensity of the violence compressed into only a few minutes. The examination of the crime scene also reinforced another important conclusion. The victims did not appear to have been selected randomly. Every person killed during the attack was connected to Wayasugi through the workplace. This observation became one of the defining features of the investigation because it supported the theory that the shootings reflected specific grievances directed toward coworkers rather than an indiscriminate attack against whoever happened to be present. Such findings influenced how investigators interpreted the sequence of events from the moment Wayasugi entered the building until he fled in the Xerox company van. Witness testimony became another critical component of the investigation. Among the most important surviving witnesses was Randall Shin, who had been present during the opening moments of the shooting but successfully escaped the building. His account helped investigators reconstruct the beginning of the attack, providing insight into how quickly the violence unfolded. In many homicide investigations, witness statements serve as essential tools for establishing chronology, particularly when victims themselves are unable to describe the events that led to their deaths. Shin's survival therefore carried significance not only on a personal level, but also within the broader effort to document the facts of the case. His observations helped investigators better understand the sequence in which the shooting developed and confirmed that the attack began suddenly, without warning, inside the Xerox office. Beyond witness testimony and physical evidence, detectives also examined Wayasugi's employment history in an effort to understand the background leading to the shootings. Information gathered during the investigation confirmed that workplace conflicts had existed before. November 2nd, coworkers had previously observed increasing isolation, hostility, and distrust in Wayasugi's behavior. Investigators learned that he believed fellow employees were working against him and intentionally, creating difficulties in his professional life. It is important to recognize, however, that investigators distinguish between these reported beliefs and independently verified facts. While witnesses confirmed that Wayasugi expressed such perceptions, the investigation did not establish evidence supporting the existence of an organized effort by co-workers to undermine him. This distinction remained essential because criminal investigations must separate subjective beliefs from objective evidence. Understanding what a suspect believed can help explain behavior, but it does not automatically establish that those beliefs reflected reality. Detectives also confirmed that Wayasugi had previously been required to participate in an anger management program after an incident at work. This information became relevant because it demonstrated that concerns regarding his behavior had existed before the shooting. Nevertheless, investigators avoided drawing simplistic conclusions. Participation in workplace intervention programs does not, by itself, predict future violence, and countless employees complete such programs without ever engaging in criminal acts. Instead, investigators considered the anger management requirement as one element within a broader pattern that included reported resentment, social isolation, and perceived workplace grievances. The challenge lay in understanding how these separate elements had eventually converged in the events of November 2nd. Another aspect of the investigation focused on the apparent selection of victims. Authorities noted that those killed were all co-workers with whom Wayasugi had worked. This pattern reinforced the conclusion that the attack had not been random. The presence of Melvin Lee among the victims also drew attention because of available information. Indicated that Wayasugi harbored particular resentment toward his supervisor. Investigators carefully examined these workplace relationships while remaining grounded in documented evidence. Their role was not to speculate about every possible motive, but to establish what could be supported through testimony, employment records, witness accounts, and physical findings. As detectives assembled the evidence, the overall sequence of events became increasingly clear. Wayasugi arrived at the Xerox office on the morning of November 2nd, carrying a Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol. He proceeded to the second floor, where technicians were working, and opened fire. Ronald Kawami and Jason Balatico were shot first, with Balatico attempting to escape before he was fatally wounded. Randall Shin survived and later provided important testimony. Wayasugi then moved to a meeting room, where Melvin Lee, Peter Mark, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, and John Sakamoto were present. The attack continued there, resulting in the deaths of all 5 men. After firing 28 rounds in total, Wayasugi fled in a Xerox company van, leading to the 5-hour police standoff near the Hawaii Nature Center before surrendering later that afternoon. By reconstructing the chronology in this manner, investigators established a coherent factual narrative that would later support criminal prosecution. Yet despite the clarity surrounding the sequence of events, one question remained resistant to complete explanation. Why had the attack occurred? Experts examining workplace violence often describe cases such as the Xerox murders as involving multiple contributing factors rather than a single identifiable cause. The available evidence pointed towards social isolation, perceived unfair treatment, long-standing resentment, and hostility within the workplace. At the same time, investigators recognized that no single factor could fully explain why 7 co-workers lost their lives that morning. The investigation therefore resisted simplistic narratives. Rather than offering one definitive answer, it documented the evidence carefully, allowing the legal process to determine criminal responsibility while acknowledging that human behavior often defies easy explanation. As detectives completed their reconstruction of the events, prosecutors began preparing the next stage of the case. The evidence collected inside the Xerox office, the witness testimony, the documented employment history, and the chronology established through the investigation would soon be presented before a jury. The emergency response had ended, and the investigative phase had produced a detailed account supported by physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. The focus now shifted to the courtroom, where the central question would no longer be what happened, but whether Byron Koji Wayasugi could be held fully criminally responsible for one of the most devastating acts of workplace violence in American history. By the time the criminal case against Byron Koji Wayasugi entered the courtroom, there was little dispute about the basic sequence of events that had unfolded on November 2nd, 1999. The investigation had established a clear timeline supported by witness testimony, physical evidence, and the recovery of the suspect shortly after the shootings. 7 Xerox employees had been killed inside the company's service office on North Nimitz Highway in Honolulu. The suspect had fled the scene in a Xerox company van, remained armed during a 5-hour standoff near the Hawaii Nature Center, and ultimately surrendered peacefully to police. Unlike many criminal trials in which the identity of the offender becomes the central issue, the legal proceedings in this case focused on a different and more complex question: whether Byron Koji Wayasugi should be held fully criminally responsible for his actions under the law. The distinction was significant because criminal responsibility depends not only on establishing that a defendant committed the acts in question, but also on determining whether the defendant possessed the legal capacity to be held accountable for those actions. As prosecutors prepared their case, they relied upon the extensive investigation conducted after the shootings. Crime scene evidence documented the locations of the victims and confirmed that 28 rounds had been fired during the attack. Witness testimony, including the account provided by survivor Randall Shin, helped reconstruct how rapidly the shootings had unfolded. Investigators had also established that the victims were not selected at random. Every person killed had worked with Wayasugi at Xerox, supporting the conclusion that the attack had been directed towards specific co-workers rather than the public at large. Together, these findings formed the factual foundation upon which the prosecution built its case. The prosecution's position centered on demonstrating that the shootings were deliberate and intentional. According to the evidence presented, Wayasugi had arrived at work carrying a Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol, proceeded to the second floor where technicians were working, and fired upon co-workers before moving to the meeting room where additional victims were located. The pattern of the attack suggested preparation rather than a spontaneous reaction to an immediate confrontation. Investigators had concluded that the victims appeared to have been chosen beforehand, a finding that became particularly important in establishing premeditation under the applicable criminal charges. From the prosecution's perspective, the sequence of events demonstrated purposeful action rather than an uncontrollable emotional outburst occurring in the heat of the moment. The defense approached the case from a different direction. Rather than disputing the fact that the shootings had occurred, defense attorneys argued that Wayasugi suffered from serious mental health problems. This argument reflected one of the central legal questions in many homicide cases involving claims of impaired mental functioning: whether a defendant's mental condition prevented him from bearing full criminal responsibility under the law. The defense sought to persuade the jury that Wayasugi's mental state should be considered when determining his legal accountability for the killings. This argument naturally drew attention to aspects of Wayasugi's personal history that had already become known during the investigation. Family members had previously stated that he experienced a head injury following an automobile accident earlier in life and that they believed his personality had changed afterward. Investigators had also documented reports describing increasing isolation, distrust of co-workers, resentment within the workplace, and his earlier participation in an anger management program. These facts form part of the broader context surrounding the defense's position. However, the existence of personal difficulties or behavioral changes does not automatically eliminate criminal responsibility. The legal system requires juries to evaluate whether a defendant's condition meets the specific legal standards governing criminal liability. Throughout the proceedings, the court considered the arguments presented by both sides. On one hand stood the prosecution's evidence describing a targeted workplace attack against co-workers, supported by witness testimony and physical evidence. On the other stood the defense's contention that serious mental health issues affected Wayasugi's capacity. The jury's responsibility was not to explain every aspect of the tragedy or answer every lingering psychological question. Instead, jurors were required to determine whether the prosecution had proven the necessary legal elements of the charged offenses and whether the defense had established a basis for reducing or eliminating criminal responsibility. The distinction between medical, psychological, and legal concepts became especially important during this process. A person may experience mental health difficulties while still being found legally responsible for criminal conduct. Likewise, the presence of unusual beliefs or emotional distress does not automatically satisfy the legal requirements necessary to excuse criminal behavior. Ultimately, the jury concluded that Wayasugi remained criminally responsible for his actions. On June 13, 2000, he was found guilty of charges related to first-degree murder. The verdict represented the culmination of months of investigative work and courtroom proceedings. For the families of the victims, the decision brought a measure of legal resolution. Although no verdict could reverse the events of November 2nd or restore the lives that had been lost. The criminal justice system could determine responsibility and impose punishment, but it could not erase the lasting emotional consequences carried by survivors, relatives, friends, and co-workers. Following the guilty verdict, the case proceeded to sentencing. In August 2000, the court imposed the most severe punishment available under Hawaii law: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the legal limitations of the state's criminal justice system. Unlike some jurisdictions in the United States, Hawaii does not impose the death penalty. As a result, life imprisonment without parole represented the maximum sentence the court could lawfully impose. The decision ensured that Waiasugi would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the opportunity for release. For many observers, the sentence also underscored an important principle within Hawaii's legal framework. Although the state rejected capital punishment, it nevertheless possessed mechanisms to impose permanent accountability for the gravest offenses. The courtroom proceedings concluded the formal legal chapter of the Xerox murders, but they did not eliminate the broader questions that continued to surround the case. Even after the verdict, experts studying workplace violence continued examining how an employee with years of technical experience and long-standing relationships with coworkers ultimately carried out such an attack. Investigators had documented workplace grievances, increasing social isolation, distrust toward colleagues, and participation in anger management efforts. Yet no single factor provided a complete explanation. The jury's task had been to determine legal responsibility rather than psychological certainty. And in that respect, the trial reached a clear conclusion. Waiasugi was guilty under the law and would remain in prison for the rest of his life. The families of the 7 victims experienced the conclusion of the trial through profoundly personal perspectives. Each legal milestone, from the presentation of evidence to the reading of the verdict and the final sentencing, represented another reminder of the lives that had been permanently altered. Court proceedings often provide structure and accountability, but they cannot fully address grief. The names Jason Balatico, Melvin Lee, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, Ronald Kawami, Peter Mark, and John Sakamoto remained at the center of the case because every legal argument ultimately traced back to the loss of 7 individuals who had gone to work expecting an ordinary day. Their absence continued long after reporters left the courthouse and the legal process came to an end. By the conclusion of the trial, Hawaii had witnessed not only the prosecution of one of its most significant criminal cases, but also a broader public discussion about workplace violence, warning signs, and prevention. The legal proceedings established criminal accountability, yet they also highlighted the limits of the justice system. Courts can determine guilt and impose punishment, but they cannot fully answer why a tragedy occurred or guarantee that similar events will never happen again. Those questions extended beyond the courtroom and into workplaces, communities, and public policy. The legacy of the Xerox murders would therefore continue to evolve long after the sentence had been imposed, influencing how employers, law enforcement agencies, and the people of Hawaii thought about workplace safety, threat recognition, and the fragile sense of security that had been shattered on a quiet Tuesday morning in November 1999. The legal proceedings against Byron Koji Waiasugi concluded with a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, bringing the criminal case to its formal end. From the perspective of the justice system, responsibility had been established, evidence had been examined, and the maximum sentence permitted under Hawaii law had been imposed. Yet for the families of the 7 victims, the co-workers who survived, and the wider community throughout Hawaii, the conclusion of the trial did not mark the end of the story. Some events become part of history because of their legal outcome. Others remain significant because they permanently change the way a community understands itself. The Xerox murders belong to the second category. Before November 2, 1999, Hawaii had long been recognized as one of the safest states in the United States. Residents often spoke of the islands not only as a place of remarkable natural beauty, but also as a community where violent crime occurred far less frequently than in many parts of the mainland. That sense of security had developed over decades and had become intertwined with Hawaii's public identity. The shooting at the Xerox office shattered that perception in only a few minutes. The event forced many residents to confront a difficult reality. No community, regardless of its reputation, is entirely immune from acts of extreme violence. The contrast between Hawaii's peaceful image and the tragedy that unfolded inside the Xerox building became one of the defining features of public discussion after the case. The attack did not occur in a place already associated with widespread violence. It happened inside an ordinary workplace where technicians repaired photocopy machines and prepared for daily service calls. There were no extraordinary circumstances surrounding the location itself. It was simply an office where employees expected another routine Tuesday. That familiarity made the crime particularly unsettling. The realization that catastrophic violence could emerge within such an ordinary setting challenged assumptions that many people had long accepted without question. Beyond the immediate shock, the Xerox murders became one of the most frequently discussed examples of workplace violence in the United States during the closing years of the 20th century. Experts studying violence in professional environments examined the case in an effort to better understand how long-standing workplace conflict, social isolation, perceived injustice, and access to firearms might intersect. Importantly, specialists generally avoided presenting the case as the product of a single cause. Instead, they viewed it as an illustration of how multiple factors may exist simultaneously without offering one complete explanation. The available evidence suggested that Wayasugi had become increasingly isolated, believed coworkers were treating him unfairly, and developed persistent hostility toward people around him. At the same time, investigators never identified one definitive event capable of fully explaining why those feelings culminated in the deliberate killing of 7 colleagues. That absence of a simple answer remains one of the most enduring aspects of the case. Human behavior, particularly acts of extraordinary violence, rarely follows a straightforward path. It is often tempting to search for a single turning point or one dramatic moment that transformed an ordinary employee into a mass murderer. The factual record surrounding the Xerox murders does not support such a conclusion. Instead, it reflects years of growing resentment, increasing withdrawal from coworkers, participation in an anger management program after a workplace incident, and reported beliefs that colleagues were intentionally working against him. Investigators documented these elements carefully, but they also recognized their limitations. None of them, considered individually, could predict the attack with certainty. Many people experience workplace conflict, frustration, or isolation without ever committing violent acts. This distinction became central to later discussions among employers and public safety experts. The challenge was not simply identifying unusual behavior, but determining how organizations should respond when multiple concerns appear together over time. One important consequence of the Xerox murders involved changes in how workplaces throughout Hawaii approached employee safety. According to the available information, the tragedy encouraged companies to place greater emphasis on recognizing potentially dangerous behavior before it escalated into violence. Employers became more attentive to reports of threatening conduct, persistent hostility, and serious interpersonal conflict within the workplace. Training related to emergency response also gained greater importance. Organizations increasingly recognized that preparing employees for unlikely but potentially catastrophic situations formed part of a broader commitment to workplace safety. Another area receiving increased attention involved procedures for reporting threats or concerning behavior. The Xerox case illustrated the difficulty of distinguishing between ordinary workplace disagreements and circumstances that might require more substantial intervention. Most professional environments inevitably experience conflict. Employees disagree with supervisors, become frustrated by organizational decisions, or experience tension with coworkers. Those situations usually remain manageable through communication, mediation, or established human resources procedures. The Xerox murders demonstrated, however, that in rare cases, unresolved grievances combined with other factors may develop in far more dangerous directions. Consequently, many organizations strengthened internal reporting processes designed to encourage employees to communicate serious concerns before they intensified. At the same time, the case also served as a reminder that prevention is extraordinarily complex. It would be inaccurate to suggest that every warning sign inevitably predicts future violence or that every socially isolated employee represents a threat. Such conclusions are unsupported by the evidence and risk unfairly stigmatizing countless individuals who never engage in criminal behavior. The lesson drawn from the Xerox murders is therefore not one of certainty, but of vigilance. Workplace concerns should be taken seriously. Patterns of escalating hostility deserve careful attention, and organizations benefit from systems that encourage communication and early intervention. Yet even with these measures, experts acknowledge that no strategy can eliminate all risk. The tragedy continues to resist simple formulas precisely because it emerged from a combination of circumstances rather than one easily identifiable cause. While discussions often focus on the offender, it is equally important to remember the 7 men whose lives ended that morning. Jason Balatico, Melvin Lee, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, Ronald Kawami, Peter Mark, and John Sakamoto were not simply names recorded in court documents. They were co-workers whose professional lives intersected every day inside the Xerox office. They were family members whose absence created lasting grief extending far beyond the workplace itself. They became victims not because they happened to be strangers in a public place, but because they shared an ordinary working environment with someone who ultimately turned violence against those around him. Their stories remind us that every statistic associated with mass violence represents individual lives interrupted without warning. For the surviving employees, November 2nd, 1999, became a dividing line between life before the shooting and life afterward. Although the factual record provided does not describe each survivor's personal journey, it is reasonable to recognize that witnessing such violence inside a familiar workplace fundamentally changes how people remember the spaces they once considered ordinary. Hallways, offices, meeting rooms, and routines become permanently connected to traumatic memories. Returning to work after such an event is never simply a matter of reopening a building. It involves rebuilding trust, restoring confidence, and supporting individuals whose understanding of safety has been profoundly altered. Even decades later, the Xerox murders continue to occupy a unique place in Hawaii's history. They remain the deadliest mass murder in the state's modern era and serve as a reminder that even communities widely regarded as peaceful are not exempt from tragedy. The case is remembered not only because of its scale, but because it challenged deeply held assumptions about where violence can occur and how suddenly ordinary life can change. It also demonstrated the importance of careful investigation, responsible journalism, and measured public discussion that avoids simplistic explanations in favor of evidence-based understanding. Perhaps the most enduring question left by the Xerox murders is the one investigators, mental health professionals, employers, and community members have continued asking for years. How can someone work beside the same people for years, sharing ordinary routines and familiar conversations, and then one day deliberately turn a weapon against them? The available evidence provides pieces of that answer: social isolation, perceived injustice, long-standing hostility, and workplace conflict, but no single explanation fully resolves the mystery. In the end, the case stands as both a criminal tragedy and a cautionary lesson. It reminds us that empathy, communication, responsible intervention, and attention to serious warning signs all matter, even though they cannot guarantee prevention. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every major criminal case are human lives forever changed, long after courtrooms fall silent and headlines disappear. The true legacy of the Xerox murders remains with the families who lost loved ones, the co-workers who survived, and a community that learned, in the most painful way imaginable, how quickly an ordinary morning can become a day remembered for generations. When a mass shooting occurs, public attention often focuses immediately on the person responsible. Investigations, court proceedings, and media coverage naturally center on the actions of the offender because authorities must determine what happened, establish accountability, and prevent further danger. However, behind every criminal case is another story that deserves equal attention: the story of the people who were lost. The Xerox murders were not only the story of Byron Koji Wayasugi and the violence he committed. They were also the story of 7 men whose lives ended inside a workplace where they had expected to spend another ordinary day. Their names became permanently connected to one of Hawaii's darkest moments, but their identities extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They were employees, coworkers, friends, and family members. They represented years of experience, personal relationships, and individual lives that existed long before November 2nd, 1999. The 7 victims of the Xerox shooting were Jason Balatico, Melvin Lee, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, Ronald Kawami, Peter Mark, and John Sakamoto. Each had arrived at work that morning as they had done many times before. They were part of the Xerox service operation in Honolulu, a group of technicians and employees responsible for maintaining equipment and supporting customers throughout the area. Their work required technical ability, reliability, and cooperation. Like many professionals, they had developed routines built around their responsibilities. They knew the tasks ahead of them, the people they worked with, and the expectations of another normal workday. None of them could have known that the office where they had built their careers would become the location where their lives would end. The tragedy of workplace violence is often found in that sudden destruction of ordinary expectations. People go to work believing that the workplace is a controlled environment. They expect challenges related to assignments, deadlines, or professional disagreements. They do not expect to face deadly violence from someone standing beside them. The victims of the Xerox murders were not individuals who entered a dangerous situation. They were employees participating in the normal routines of professional life. That reality remains one of the most painful elements of the case. Among the victims was Melvin Lee, 58 years old, who served as a supervisor at Xerox and had worked with Wayasugi. Because of his position, Lee became one of the individuals at the center of discussion surrounding the motive behind the attack. Investigators determined that Wayasugi held particular resentment toward him, viewing him as a symbol of workplace problems he believed existed. However, the evidence did not establish wrongdoing by Lee. To coworkers, he was a supervisor carrying out his professional responsibilities. To his family and friends, he was a person whose life contained far more meaning than the role he held inside the office. His death represented not only the loss of an employee, but the loss of an individual whose absence affected everyone who knew him. Jason Balatico, 33 years old, was another victim whose life was cut short that morning. According to the established sequence of events, Balatico attempted to escape after the shooting began, but was fatally wounded. His effort to survive reflects the chaos and suddenness of the attack. Like the others, he had not entered the office expecting danger. He had entered as a worker beginning another day. His death became part of a tragedy that unfolded faster than anyone inside the building could comprehend. The remaining victims: Ford Kanehira, 41, Ronald Kataoka, 50, Ronald Kawami, 54, Peter Mark, 46, and John Sakamoto, 36, shared the same devastating circumstance. They were co-workers caught in an attack directed toward people connected to Wayasugi's workplace. Grievances. Their lives became intertwined in public memory because of the violence that ended them. But their significance was not defined by the crime. Each person represented relationships and experiences that continued after their deaths through the people who knew and loved them. One of the challenges in discussing cases of mass violence is avoiding the reduction of victims into numbers. During news coverage and official statements, large numbers often become the primary way tragedies are described. In the Xerox murders, the number 7 carries historical significance because it represents the highest number of people killed in a single criminal incident in modern Hawaii at that time. Yet behind that number were 7 separate individuals. 7 families received devastating news. 7 groups of friends lost someone they knew. 7 professional lives ended in a place where they had expected to be safe. Remembering this human dimension is essential because criminal cases can sometimes become dominated by discussions of the offender's motives, psychological condition, or legal arguments. Those issues matter for understanding and accountability, but they should never overshadow the lives of the victims. The central reality of the Xerox murders is not simply that Byron Wayasugi committed an act of violence. It is that 7 people who had nothing to do with creating the circumstances that led to the attack lost their lives because they became targets of someone else's anger and resentment. Their families and co-workers were left to deal with consequences that extended far beyond the day itself. The impact of such a tragedy does not end when investigators leave the crime scene or when a court announces a sentence. For those personally connected to the victims, grief continues long after public attention fades. Anniversaries, memories, and ordinary moments can all become reminders of the person who is no longer present. Although the available record does not provide detailed personal accounts from each family, the lasting effects of losing a loved one in sudden violence are a fundamental part of understanding the human cost of the case. The surviving employees of Xerox also carried the weight of what happened. They had not simply witnessed a crime, they had experienced the destruction of a familiar environment. A workplace is usually associated with productivity, cooperation, and routine. After November 2nd, 1999, the Xerox office represented something entirely different. Employees who returned after the tragedy faced the challenge of continuing in a place forever connected to loss. The process of recovery from such an event involves more than repairing physical surroundings. It requires rebuilding a sense of safety and trust. The Xerox murders also changed the way many people in Hawaii thought about workplace relationships. Before the shooting, co-workers often represented a daily source of familiarity. Employees spent hours together, shared professional challenges, and developed connections through years of interaction. The attack forced many to consider a disturbing possibility that someone who appears familiar may still carry private struggles and resentment that others cannot fully see. This realization did not mean that workplaces should become places of suspicion, but it highlighted the importance of communication and awareness. In remembering the victims, it is also important to recognize that they were not defined by the moment of their deaths. They were technicians, colleagues, and members of a community. They contributed their skills and time to their profession. They had personal histories that existed before the tragedy and continued through the memories of those who knew them. The most meaningful way to remember them is not simply by repeating the circumstances of their deaths, but by acknowledging the lives they lived before that final morning. Years after the Xerox murders, the names of Jason Balatico, Melvin Lee, Ford Kanehira, Ronald Kataoka, Ronald Kawami, Peter Mark, and John Sakamoto remain attached to one of Hawaii's most painful events. Yet their legacy should not exist only within the context of violence. Their memory represents the importance of recognizing victims as complete human beings rather than merely names in a criminal record. The story of the Xerox murders is ultimately a story of loss, the loss of 7 individuals, the loss of a community's sense of security, and the loss of an ordinary workplace forever changed by an extraordinary act of violence. While the investigation, trial, and sentence provided legal answers, the emotional consequences continued far beyond the courtroom. The final chapter of this tragedy is not written only through what happened on November 2nd, 1999, but through how the people left behind continue to remember those who never returned home.